So this is Revelation chapter 22, the scripture for Monday the 30th of November. Now, in approaching this final chapter of Revelation, I'd like to remind you of the context of the letter. You see, John, as you may remember, is writing to a persecuted people, himself writing from exile. And he's trying to remind these first century Christians why they can have hope in the midst of a Roman Empire that seems to be stripping hope from them. And so I think that this makes some of his rhetoric here in the prophecy that he has, the visions that he has, all the more stunning. I would expect someone like John to completely exclude Rome, or anything that may remind his hearers of Rome, from his vision of the promise awaiting believers. Clearly, if Rome has been persecuting believers, it should be excluded from the kingdom of heaven, is how my thought process would go. But that's not how God does it. That's not how John shares it. Not only is the New Jerusalem cosmopolitan in the same way as Rome, drawing from many tribes, many tongues, many nations, many peoples, but the tree of life that John sees here in this last chapter is for the healing of the nations. Not just for the Hebrews. This is not just for the persecuted people to have some sort of a balm or a salve for their wounds. No, this is for all of the nations. Those who were persecuted and those who were doing the persecuting. There's a style of theology known as apophatic theology. You may have heard it as negative theology. The whole idea with this theology is that it is very difficult to comprehend God. And it's a little bit easier to put limitations on what God is not. And in doing so, then to be able to more accurately understand who God is. So, for example, God is not bound by space or time. God is unchanging. So because of that, God is omnipresent, right? Not bound by space or time. God is unchanging, which means that God is consistent. God is free from sin, so God is holy. These sorts of ways of understanding God. And some of how John describes the holy city in this final chapter and in the previous chapter is similar. In verse 3, he says, there's no longer any curse. In verse 5, there's no night. Therefore, there's no need for the lights or the stars or the sun or the moon or whatnot. From the last chapter, chapter 21, verse 22, there's no temple. And all of these things get at sort of a greater truth. God's presence is the temple. God's presence is our light. God's presence frees us from the curse. And to imagine what this means positively, I think is outside of our fallen comprehension. We have no experience living in full freedom, freed from the curse of sin and death. Something I can't wait to experience. Now, in spite of all he's seen, and in spite of having just been, cautioned against this just a couple chapters before, John again tries to worship the angel, showing him all these things. And again, the angel points him in the right direction. Worship God alone. Now, interestingly, in light of some of this, in verse 11, it seems that this letter isn't designed to be evangelical or to convert non-believers, that this letter may be primarily for those who are already trying to worship God, making sure that they're properly directed in their worship. There's almost a policy of non-intervention put forward here. Rather than persuading folks who aren't Christian to change their behavior, Revelation aims to encourage those who are already part of the church. And this is a helpful instruction, I think, to us also. We are tempted, I think, sometimes to appoint ourselves the spiritual overseers of other people's lives. And in 1 Peter 4, you might remember, we're cautioned against doing that very thing. Instead, what we're called to do there and here is to continue growing in grace, letting us offer healing for the nations instead of forcing healing upon the nations. So, what message does this book have for us today? Well, I think we're called to join with the Spirit, called to be part of the bride of Christ, asking for him to come again soon. And all who are thirsty are invited to drink of the waters of life, just as in Isaiah 55:1. So some of these promises are already being fulfilled in the here and now. We're called to look to the return of Christ for our ultimate deliverance and to make that daily request of God to return, setting all things right forever. So I wonder, what helps you to pray continually for the return of Jesus? That's all for Revelation 22, and that concludes the book of Revelation. Tomorrow, the 1st of December, we'll look at John, the Gospel of John, chapter 1. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.